The loudest sound in the world is your own boot hitting the ground. This was the lesson the 9 Marines had learned in the hedgerows of Normandy. Now, at 2:43 a.m. on June 23rd, 1944, they put that lesson to the ultimate test. They crouched barefoot in the cold mud, their standard-issue boots left behind in a neat, ghostly line beneath a collapsed hedge 50 yards away. The rain had stopped, leaving the world soaked and unnervingly still. Every drip from a helmet brim, every creak of a rifle strap, every thunderous breath from the man beside you could betray your position. Their mission was audacious: ambush and eliminate 6 German patrols operating between the village of Saint-Germain-d'El and Hill 213. The orders were absolute. No gunfire unless absolutely necessary. No noise, no trace. They were to become phantoms in the fog. These men were United States Marines, a fact that itself was an anomaly in the European theater. While their brothers fought in the iconic battles of the Pacific Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Iwo Jima, this small, specialized reconnaissance platoon from the 2nd Marine Division had been quietly attached to Army units after the D-Day landings. Their number was small, barely 24, and their mission was not for headlines. They were experts in stealth, sabotage, and infiltration, tasked with finding the gaps in the German lines. The area near Saint-Lô was a nightmare maze of hedgerows, ancient, shoulder-high walls of earth, and thick brush that turned the countryside into a claustrophobic labyrinth. Visibility was measured in feet. Artillery was useless. Movement was slow, dangerous, and above all, loud. The Germans, many of them hardened veterans of the Eastern Front, had turned the terrain into a lethal sound trap. They littered paths with broken glass, chicken bones, and slivers of aluminum that crunched and snapped underfoot. They listened patiently for the slightest betrayal. The unit was led by Lieutenant Jack Fenton, a 28-year-old from Oklahoma whose quiet demeanor belied a sharp, analytical mind. He had already fought in the Pacific and understood that brute force was suicide here. Beside him was Sergeant William Red Haskins, a man in his early 30s from Pennsylvania whose reputation included moving faster barefoot than most men could run in boots. The youngest was Private James Corey, a 19-year-old farm boy from Iowa who had never seen a city before being shipped to war. They had all been trained for chaos, but Normandy was different. It was cold, wet, and intimate. You could smell the enemy tobacco, gun oil, unwashed wool before you saw them. In their first weeks, the Marines learned the hard way that a single misplaced sound was a death sentence. A boot on a hidden tin can, the faint clink of a canteen against a buckle, one cough each had triggered instant devastating machine gun fire from unseen positions. They lost men without ever engaging the enemy. The fear was no longer just of bullets, but of the sound of their own footsteps, their own breathing. After the death of Private Keller, killed by a single unseen rifle shot following the faint metallic clink of his gear, silence became an obsession. They stopped speaking in the field, communicating only with hand signals. They chewed on cloth to muffle their breath. Some refused food before patrols, but it was never enough. Standing at the edge of a hedgerow one night, listening to the muffled squelch of his men's boots in the mud, Lieutenant Fenton had his realization. If sound was the enemy, the solution was not to muffle it, but to eliminate it entirely. He looked at Haskins and gave the unthinkable order. Take them off. There was a moment of stunned disbelief. Private Corey voiced the collective fear of broken glass and barbed wire. But Fenton's quiet certainty left no room for argument. And if you keep those boots on, you're not walking out of here at all. One by one, they bent down and untied their laces, removing the mud-caked, salt-stiff leather that had been their armor. The cold ground was a shock, jagged and unforgiving. But as their bare toes sank into the wet earth, a transformation began. They moved out, toes first, feeling their way through the dark. The cold mud was a constant shock, but it was the sharp, hidden threats that demanded every ounce of their focus stones, like broken plates, splintered wood, unseen thorns. Lieutenant Fenton's instruction echoed in their minds. Move like cats. No heel strikes, just a careful, rolling pressure from the ball of the foot to the toes. Every step was a calculation, a silent negotiation with the earth itself. The fear that had once paralyzed them began to recede, replaced by a hyper-awareness that was almost meditative. They were no longer foreigners in this landscape. They were becoming part of it. They could feel the difference between gravel and soft soil, between safe moss and decaying, noisy branches. And with this new connection came a new sense. They could now hear the enemy with terrifying clarity. The contrast was electric. Where their own movement was a whisper, the approach of the first German patrol was a cacophony. The heavy, metallic clunk of hobnailed boots on gravel, the jingle of equipment, the low muttering of voices, it all traveled through the sound chamber of the hedgerows like a broadcast. The Germans, 4 of them, walked 2 by 2 down a narrow lane, laughing casually, utterly unaware that 9 pairs of eyes were watching from less than 20 feet away. Fenton gave the signal. A clenched fist, then 3 fingers, then a sharp point forward. The Marines glided from their hiding places. They did not run. They flowed, knees bent, their bare feet making no sound on the grass. It was over in under 15 seconds. 2 men broke left, 2 right, a 5th up the center. A hand clamped over a mouth, a knife drawn across a throat, a brutal chokehold. They were shadows, swift and silent. The patrol was gone, dragged into the brush, their weapons and intel collected. One of them carried a map detailing routes and rendezvous codes, an intelligence goldmine. The Marines melted back into the darkness before the echo of the Germans' last footsteps had faded. They repositioned, their breathing steady, their senses sharpened to a razor's edge. The silence was no longer a defensive tactic. It was a weapon, and they were learning its weight and balance. Later, as they closed in on the second patrol, 6 men moving through a patch of apple trees, the lead German lit a cigarette. The match flared like a beacon. Fenton tapped 2 fingers against his thigh. Haskins and Corey moved. They slid under the low-hanging branches, their bare feet soundless on the damp grass. The last man in the column took 1 step too many away from his comrades. A tackle, a hand stifling a cry, a quick, lethal blade. The others moved in synchrony. 3 more Germans fell within seconds. 2 fumbled for their rifles, but the Marines were already inside their guard, too close, too fast. 1 was slammed backward into a tree trunk, the air driven from his lungs before Haskins finished him. The last man dropped his weapon and ran. Corey gave chase, his bare feet gripping the uneven ground with a surety boots could never provide. He caught the fleeing soldier, grabbing him by the back of the neck and dragging him down into the mud. He did not use his knife. Instead, he gagged and bound the man. They needed a prisoner. 2 patrols had been erased, and not a single shot had been fired. As they vanished again into the gloom, Private Corey, his heart pounding not from fear, but from a strange, exhilarated clarity, whispered the only words spoken that night. We're ghosts. It was not boastful. It was a realization. For the first time since landing in France, they were not the hunted. They were the hunters. Unit, barely 19. A farm boy from Iowa who had never seen a city, let alone a war. These men had been trained for chaos, but Normandy introduced them to something different. It was not the heat or the shouting of the Pacific. It was cold, wet, close. You could smell the Germans before you saw them. Tobacco, gun oil, and the sour scent of unwashed wool. You could hear their patrols laughing in the dark. You could hear their dogs. The Marines quickly learned that every move they made echoed in the hedge. Every branch cracked underfoot was a bullet waiting to happen. Patrol after patrol, the Germans moved like they owned the night. The Americans, they were guests, unwelcome, exposed, and outnumbered. By the 3rd week of June, Lieutenant Fenton had seen enough. Too many patrols were being ambushed before they could reach their objectives. Too many good men were bleeding into the mud, and always the common thread was noise. Something had to change, and when it did, no one could have predicted how simple and how effective the answer would be. The Germans did not need to see you in the bocage. They just needed to hear you. In Normandy's hedge country, death did not announce itself with tanks or planes. It came in the form of a misplaced footstep, a snapped twig, the soft metallic rattle of a belt buckle. The hedgerows, centuries old, earthen walls, thick with brambles, created natural sound chambers. Every whisper, every breath, every scuff of a boot on stone bounced between walls of leaves and clay like a flare in the dark, and the Germans were listening. The first time it happened, the Marines thought it was a fluke. A patrol had moved out just before dawn. Standard formation, weapons low, voices off. Halfway down a sunken lane, a single boot landed on a pile of loose tin cans someone had rigged into the hedgerow. The sound was sharp, sudden, and unmistakable. 4 seconds later, machine gun fire tore through the foliage. 2 men died instantly. 1 more was wounded trying to drag a body out of the mud. They never saw the enemy. By the third encounter like that, Lieutenant Fenton knew it was not bad luck. It was physics. The very tools that had served them in every other battlefield, steel, leather, brass, had become liabilities in this one. The gear squeaked, it clicked, it scraped, and the boots, those boots so essential in the Pacific's jagged coral or the black sand of Ewima, were now betraying them with every step. The Germans had learned the terrain. Their patrols were disciplined, quiet, and lethal. Many were veterans of the Eastern Front, men who had survived Stalingrad and the forests of Belarus. They set traps not just for the body, but for the ear. Broken glass in shallow ditches, chicken bones, slivers of aluminum from wrecked aircraft, carefully sprinkled like gravel across height traffic paths. They even trained dogs to bark at unnatural rhythms of movement, marching patterns, American pacing. The Marines were being hunted through sound. Fenton began to notice something terrifying. Even when they moved in total silence, the men were starting to freeze. Not out of fear of bullets, but out of fear of sound itself. The mission was collapsing under the weight of the silence they couldn't achieve. Sergeant Haskins described it best in a letter he would write months later. It was not the Germans that scared me. It was my own footsteps. I could hear my heartbeat in my ankles. That is how close death felt. One misstep and you did not go home. You just disappeared into the leaves. They tried everything. They wrapped cloth around their boots. They oiled their weapons to silence the metal. They tied down gear with wire and soaked their packs to keep them from rustling. But nothing worked completely. A single mistake, 1 cough, 1 unlucky footfall, and the hedge came alive with fire. One night they lost a man without even engaging the enemy. Private Keller, 22 years old, a radio operator. His squad had paused in a ditch when Keller stood to adjust his harness. The movement caused his canteen to slip and strike the buckle of his web belt. It made a faint clink, barely audible in normal terrain. But not here. A German flare went up 20 seconds later. In the green light, someone fired a single rifle round. Keller fell backward into the ditch, stone dead. His unit never saw who fired. The Germans did not advance. They were just listening, waiting. One sound was all they needed. After Keller's death, silence became obsession. The men stopped speaking entirely in the field. They developed hand signals and learned to read each other's eyes. They chewed on strips of cloth to muffle their breathing when they crawled. Some refused food for 24 hours before patrols, fearing the sound of their own digestion. At night, the woods grew so quiet it became unnerving, like the entire world had stopped breathing, and still it was not enough. Fenton stood at the edge of a hedgerow one night, watching as his men prepared to move. He could hear it, the faint brushing of canvas and leather, the muffled squish of a boot in wet soil. To him, it sounded like an alarm bell. That was the moment. The realization came like a whisper, but it hit him like a bullet. If sound was the enemy, then the solution had to be complete silence. Not muffled, not reduced, eliminated. He looked down at his own boots. Then he looked up at Haskins and said 2 words no one expected. Take them off. Barefoot soldiers. At first they thought he was joking. Take them off? Sergeant Haskins repeated, blinking in the dark. Take what off, sir? Your boots, Lieutenant Fenton said. All of you off now. No one moved. Around them the hedge were still. The smell of damp leaves and old gunpowder hung heavy in the air. Somewhere far off, a flare hissed upward, but in their corner of Normandy, there was only silence and disbelief. Private Corey was the first to speak. Sir, there's barbed wire out here, broken glass. We're not exactly walking on carpet. Fenton didn't flinch. And if you keep those boots on, you're not walking out of here at all. That was the moment. A single line delivered without drama, without shouting, just quiet, unshakable certainty. The kind of command that doesn't demand obedience. It simply leaves no room for doubt. And so, one by one, the men bent down and began untying their laces. They removed their boots slowly, like it was a sacred ritual. Some had been wearing the same pair since the beaches, mud-caked, salt-stiff, heavy with the weight of survival. A Marine's boots were like his rifle, worn, familiar, trusted. Taking them off felt like stripping away armor. The ground beneath was cold, shockingly cold. Normandy nights in June were not kind. The earth was soft in some places, jagged in others, sharp rocks, wet grass, hidden splinters of old wooden fences and shrapnel, buried under weeks of shelling. Private Corey's foot landed on something that bit back, a stone flat and serrated like a broken plate. He sucked in air between his teeth, but said nothing. Fenton watched as each man stood barefoot in the mud, weapons slung over their shoulders, breath steaming in the air. "Now you listen," he said. "You move like cats. No heel strikes, toes first. You feel your way through every step. If something cuts you, take it. Better a thorn in your foot than a bullet in your skull." Nobody spoke. But in that moment, a transformation had begun. Sergeant Haskins would later write that it was the quietest patrol he ever led. Not because of the lack of talking, but because something in them had shifted. They were no longer moving through the land. They had become part of it. Every step became a calculation. They moved slower, yes. But they moved with purpose, with control, with awareness. Bare feet on cold dirt. There was no room for mistakes. They could feel everything now. The difference between gravel and soil, between moss and decaying wood, between life and death. At one point, Haskins stepped into a shallow puddle filled with rainwater and blood. He did not recoil. He paused, breathed out slowly, then kept moving. The men adjusted quickly. Muscle memory rerat itself in minutes. No more dragging heels, no more careless stumbles. Even breathing changed, timed with the wind, the rustling leaves, the distant thunder of artillery, and something else happened. Something none of them expected. The fear began to fade. Not entirely. This was war, after all. But the tension, that suffocating awareness of betrayal by sound, began to ease. They could hear themselves, yes, but they could also hear the enemy more clearly. That night, as they neared the first patrol route, they heard them. German boots on gravel, the heavy clunk of hobnailed soles, voices muttering in low tones. The contrast was electric. One side moved like iron through the woods, the other like shadows. At that moment, Fenton gave a new signal, 2 fingers to the eyes, then a sweeping motion across the field. His men understood instantly. They weren't just going to evade the patrol, they were going to take them. That was the second transformation. This was no longer a desperate tactic. It was a weapon. The silence, the bare feet, the focus, it gave them control. In a war where every inch was chaos, they had found stillness, precision. The first ambush was clean. 2 Germans at the rear, separated from their unit by maybe 10 paces. 1 Marine per man. A hand over the mouth. A knife beneath the ribs. No sound, no struggle. The rest of the patrol never knew what happened. They simply walked on. The Marines melted back into the hedger, breath steady, eyes forward. Later, as they repositioned for a second approach, Private Corey whispered the only words spoken that night. "We're ghosts." It was not bravado. It was realization. For the first time since landing in Normandy, they were not being hunted. They were the hunters. The rest of the night passed in a rhythm, a dance of dirt and blood, silence and motion. Every move was deliberate, every sound calculated. They began to notice things they never had before. Crickets stopping suddenly when someone approached. The shift in bird calls when a presence moved beneath the trees. Their senses sharpened. Their movements became fluid. At one point, Haskins thought he heard a man sneeze, 30 yards away behind a hedgerow. A single sneeze. That was enough. 2 men circled around. 10 minutes later, another patrol was gone. It was working. The boots had been a prison, a blindfold, a barrier between them and the land they were trying to survive in. Now, without them, they had become something else. Not superhuman, not invisible, just connected, alert, alive in a way few soldiers ever experience. And by dawn, they would prove that connection could be deadly. 6 patrols, one night. The first German patrol, appeared at 0300 hours. 4 men, shadows moving with practiced ease down a narrow dirt lane that ran between 2 overgrown hedgerows. They carried rifles slung over their shoulders, walked 2 by 2, and spoke in low, casual tones, laughing even. They had no idea they were being watched. From less than 20 feet away, 9 pairs of eyes followed every movement. The Marines lay flat, breath held, bodies pressed into the wet soil like they had grown there. Not a twig moved, not a leaf trembled. The only sound was the faint rustle of German boots on gravel. Fenton gave the signal. A clenched fist, then 3 fingers, then 1, then a sharp point forward. Go! The Marines moved like animals, quick, silent, low. 2 men broke left, 2 right. A 5th came up the center. They did not run. They glided, knees bent, weight on the balls of their feet. Bare skin made no sound on the grass. In under 15 seconds, it was over. 1 German was taken from behind, a knife across the throat, dropped into a ditch. The 2nd never saw the blow that crushed his windpipe. The 3rd and 4th were subdued with such precision, neither had time to cry out. The entire patrol was gone, just like that. No shots, no blood trail, no noise. The Marines dragged the bodies deeper into the brush, stripped the weapons, and checked for intel. 1 carried a map, routes, times, Rendezvous codes, a gold mine. They vanished before the next patrol even passed. 15 minutes later, they struck again. This time it was 6 Germans, walking in a staggered column through a patch of apple trees. The lead man lit a cigarette. A mistake. The match flared like a beacon in the dark. Fenton tapped 2 fingers against his thigh. Haskins and Corey moved first. 1 Marine slid in from the left flank, crouched low under the limbs. He waited until the last man stepped forward, just 1 pace away from his comrades. Then he acted. A tackle, a hand over the mouth, a blade drawn across the collarbone, quick, clean, quiet. Simultaneously, the others moved. 3 Germans fell within seconds. 2 tried to respond, raising their rifles, but the Marines were already inside their formation. No time, no space, no direction. 1 German stumbled backward into a tree, gasping. Before he could call out, Haskins hit him from the side, knocking the air out of his lungs. He never made a sound. The last man dropped his weapon and ran. Corey chased him down barefoot over branches and stones, never once slipping. When he caught up, he grabbed the German by the back of the neck and dragged him to the ground. He did not kill him, he tied him. He gagged him. They needed 1 alive. That was patrol number 2. Still no shots fired. By the time the 3rd German unit entered the area, somewhere around 0400 hours, the woods were already haunted. The bodies of 10 soldiers lay hidden beneath hedge. None had been found. None had reported back. This group was bigger. 8 men, younger, jittery. They had likely been sent to investigate the silence. The Marines adjusted tactics. Fenton whispered 1 word: divide. They broke into 3 groups, creating overlapping fields of approach. No longer a single ambush line, but a circle. The Germans walked into it. The first kill came from behind. A simple gur pulled tight around the throat. The 2nd Marine tackled his target into a ditch, breaking his fall with his own body to silence the impact. But the 3rd man resisted. He shouted just once. A single cry, half a syllable, more reflex than warning. The Marines froze. In the distance, a dog barked, then silence. No response, no flare, no gunfire. They had maybe 30 seconds to finish it, and they did. The rest of the patrol was dispatched with brutal efficiency. 1 man was forced to run, tripping over a route and slamming headfirst into a tree trunk. The Marines found him dazed. Corey finished it with the butt of his rifle, still unfired. The shout did not cost them, but it sharpened their urgency. The 4th patrol came at 0430. 11 men with radios, more organized, more alert. They walked slower, spread out, rifles in hand. This was not a patrol. It was a sweep. The Marines waited until the group crossed into a narrow causeway flanked by high earthen banks. No room to maneuver. Perfect. Fenton whispered, now. A single signal flare shot up into the sky, but it was not German. It was American, green. The Germans looked up. That was all the time they needed. The Marines struck from both sides. No guns, just ropes, knives, and fists. They moved through the patrol like a storm through dry grass. Silent, fast, final. The first 3 Germans went down before the others knew what was happening. The rest scattered, but they had nowhere to go. The hedge boxed them in. 2 surrendered. 1 tried to climb the bank and slipped. 10 down, 1 captured. That was 29 Germans removed in under 90 minutes. The 5th and 6th patrols came almost back-to-back close to dawn. Smaller units confused, responding to missing reports. They were cautious, uncertain, and that was exactly what made them vulnerable. By then, the Marines had turned the forest into a hunting ground. Every approach route had been mapped, every weak spot exploited. They moved with ghost-like precision, cloaked by mud, shadow, and silence. The 5th patrol never saw them. The 6th fired a single shot, wild, blind, and far too late. It struck a tree. No one was hit. By 0500 hours, the mission was complete. 6 patrols, 38 enemy soldiers, 5 captured, 0 gunshots fired by the Americans, and not a single Marine killed. They regrouped in a ruined barn, divided by 4 miles from the first contact point, bloodied, bruised, feet raw and blistered, but alive. Fenton counted heads. All present, Haskins said. They sat in silence for a long moment. Then Private Corey, exhausted, smiled. "Sir," he said. "Can I have my boots back now?" Fenton looked at him and nodded. "You earned them." The power of silence. At dawn, the fog still clung to the trees like a veil. The barn where the Marines regrouped had once belonged to a French farmer, long since evacuated or buried by war. Its roof was partially collapsed. The walls were pockmarked by shrapnel and small arms fire. But for now, it was shelter. Inside, the 9 Barefoot men sat quietly on broken crates and upturned buckets. Their feet were filthy, mud-caked, bruised, blistered, bleeding in places. Corey had wrapped a torn bandage around his big toe. Haskins used part of his undershirt to cushion a gash near his heel. Fenton simply rested against a beam, eyes closed, hands clasped around his carbine like a prayer. No one spoke. They did not have to. It was not just fatigue. It was something heavier. The silence they had used as a weapon now hung in the air as something sacred. Like if they broke it, the spell would be undone, and the ghosts they had become would turn back into men. Eventually, a medic from the army unit found them. He stepped into the barn, stopped cold, and looked at the scene. 9 Marines caked in dirt, stripped down to undershirts, feet bare, weapons dry and clean. There was no gunpowder smell, no signs of a firefight, just exhaustion and blood. "What the hell happened here?" he asked. Fenton opened one eye. "Quiet work," he said. That morning, the reports began to come in from other Allied units in the sector. Radio intercepts from German frequencies showed sudden gaps in communication. 6 patrols had failed to report in. Headquarters had scrambled to locate them, sent out reinforcements, recon planes, even artillery preps, only to find nothing. No bodies, no resistance, no trace, just silence. The Marines' operation had disrupted the enemy's night surveillance network across nearly 3 kilometers of front line. Without those patrols, the Germans had no way of tracking Allied movement in the area. Within 24 hours, elements of the United States 2nd Infantry Division advanced through that exact corridor, uncontested. What the Marines had done without firing a single shot had created a corridor of uncertainty in the German line. And in war, uncertainty can be fatal. A colonel from Army Intelligence came down the next day to ask Fenton what kind of support they had used. How many suppressed weapons, he asked? None. Demolitions, just knives and rope. Jesus. The colonel muttered. But it was Haskins who said the line everyone remembered. He stood there barefoot and limping and said, "Sometimes the loudest thing you can do in a war is shut the hell up." Word of the Barefoot ambush spread quietly. First through whispers, then through reports, then through training memos marked confidential. It would never make the papers. There were no medals handed out, no unit citations. It was not that kind of mission. But within a month, other reconnaissance teams, Army Rangers, OSS operatives, even French resistance cells began experimenting with similar tactics. Not all went barefoot, but the principle had taken root. Silence was a tactic now. Not just the absence of sound, but the application of it, the discipline to withhold movement, to control the body down to the breath, the understanding that sometimes in a war full of noise, it was the quietest men who could change the map. For the Marines who had been there, the night became something more than a mission. It became a memory etched into skin and nerve. Corey would later write, "I can still feel the mud between my toes. I can still hear nothing. That's the strange part. I hear the silence. It was heavier than gunfire. It stayed with you." Years later, when he told the story to his grandson, he held up one of his old boots, polished, cracked, with the laces still tied from that night. He pointed to it and said, "This boot saved my feet in the Pacific, but it almost killed me in France, so I left it behind." That's how we won that night. We let go of what we thought we needed. Legacy of the Barefoot Marines. Time has a way of silencing even the most remarkable stories. The Barefoot ambush near Street Blow was never mentioned in official communiques. It did not appear in newsreels or victory parades. The men who carried it out returned to their units, pulled their boots back on, and kept fighting. Some died weeks later in the hedge. Others lived into old age and never spoke of that night again. But the silence they wielded did not disappear. It became a lesson. One passed not through headlines, but through whispers, field manuals, and the knowing nods of soldiers who understood that sometimes to win a war, you have to let go of everything except the mission, even your boots. In the decades after the war, military thinkers revisited small unit tactics in hostile terrain. The Barefoot operation was cited in classified training seminars as an example of environmental integration, a concept that would influence everything from reconnaissance doctrine to special forces training. But for those 9 men, it was never about innovation. It was about survival. It was about adapting. Not because they wanted to, but because they had no other choice. It was about turning fear into awareness and awareness into control. It was about making the ground an ally instead of an obstacle. And it was about silence. Not just the absence of noise, but the discipline of it. The kind of silence that requires total trust between men. The kind that forces you to listen to the earth, to your breath, to the heartbeat of your enemy. Sergeant Haskins, before his death in 1989, was interviewed for a small veterans oral history project in Pennsylvania. When asked what he remembered most about the war, he didn't talk about the beaches or the battles. He said this, "I remember the night we took off our boots. That was the moment I stopped feeling like a soldier and started feeling like a human again, because it reminded me war is loud, but life is quiet. And if you can walk through hell without making a sound, maybe you're still alive in there somewhere. Today, the site of the ambush is overgrown. The hedge remained, though the scars of battle have softened. Somewhere beneath the trees, perhaps still buried in the soil, lies a single boot left behind that night, never recovered. It is not marked on any memorial. There is no plaque. But if you stand there just before dawn and close your eyes, you might still hear the silence. And in that silence, you might understand what those Marines discovered. That courage is not always about charging forward, but sometimes about standing still, listening, and daring to move without a sound. Because in a war full of thunder, one night of silence changed everything. What shocked you most? The silence or the courage it took to use it? Let us know in the comments. And if you believe stories like this deserve to be heard, share it. Because some of the greatest victories in history happened when no one was listening.